I'm Pam Goins, the Executive Director of NASCA. We are so thrilled to have you with us this afternoon for this exciting conversation. Again, we're bringing together our state and our corporate partners around this conversation about returning to the workplace, returning to the office environment, and really building out those safety precautions for all of our staff, as well as those citizens coming into our public buildings. We've got a great afternoon for you. And again, so thrilled that you're joining us. If you're just dialing in, make sure that you rename yourself, show us your name and your state or your company so we know who you're with. We're going to kick off this afternoon with a couple of polls, just as a stage setter, to really see what's happening in your states. Again, as we're unpacking this idea about returning to the workplace. So let's bring up our first poll for the afternoon. Take a look at this question. Approximately in your own state, what's the percentage of state employees who are currently working in a remote environment for the majority of the work week? Take just a second to respond to that first one. The second one looks at your public state-owned buildings. Those leased buildings, those public buildings, are they open to the public? Take just a second and respond to the first and second poll question, and then we'll show the results. So I think that will really set the stage for part of the conversation that we're going to have this afternoon as we're looking at bringing folks back into public office buildings, as well as working with the citizens that you do on an everyday basis. Again, I will ask if you're not actively engaged in asking a question, if you'll please mute your computer. That helps us on our side with the recording. All right, Kayla, let's take a look at the results. Oh, pretty mixed across the board. It looks like the majority of our states are in the top 25th percentile of employees that are currently working in a remote environment, at least for part of the week. And interestingly enough, few state buildings are actually open to the public. So again, good foundation setting for the work that we're going to be talking about today. And we do have, again, a great combination of our state and our corporate partners coming together for today's discussion. Let me introduce our speakers. We have Sunana Minawat from IBM. She serves as the Executive Director of Business Development for Public Health at IBM Watson. In her role, she brings together her expertise in public health, health policy, technology, data, and domain knowledge to address the technology and data needs of the COVID-19 public health emergency and simultaneous economic recovery. We also have Jyothi Bhatia Peters, and she's a growth leader for the employer market in the payer and employer division of IBM Watson Health. And she's based out of the Cambridge, Massachusetts office. In her role, she leads a team of client executives and account executives that bring support to the larger clients in the private sector and the public sector as well. And then later with our state panelists, we'll be adding Amy Harpst. She has over 20 years experience in the IWMS market space. She's consulted and led on implementation projects for Fortune 100 clients, including business analysis, solution scoping, and project management. And then we'll be joined this afternoon by 3 of our state chief administrators who will be coming together to bring some of the conditions that are happening in their states as well. And I'm thrilled to have Tricia Bach, who's the director of the Wyoming Department of Administration and Information, Amy Fetcher, who's a cabinet secretary from the Arkansas Department of Transformation and Shared Services, and then our NASCA president, Bram Stibbets, who's the director of the Michigan Department of Technology, Management, and Budget, and he's also the state CIO. So with that, let me turn our presentation time over to Sunana and to Jyothi, and we'll get started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you all for the opportunity to be speaking with you today. We are going to begin with a short discussion and then, as Pam said, open it up. Today, what we want to talk a little bit about is return to work places and how to optimize state government public spaces safely and how to bring back employees into the workplaces safely. So with that, let's move to our first slide. So we know that governments are facing an overwhelming need to optimize the use of current state buildings and the employee experience. As you'll see on our next slide, and from what you just shared through the poll questions, about 48% of government workers are now working remotely. That's roughly in line with what you all just shared through your poll questions with us as well. 46% of them had not been doing so prior to the pandemic. That's been a huge culture shift. We also know that 60% of folks, of employees working from home would like to return to the workplace in some capacity. Now, the answers to your poll questions have shown a great amount of diversity in these questions as well. And this data, coupled with NASCA's 2021 priorities around optimizing the workplace, employee engagement, and digital government, are really what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. Next slide, Kelly.
Because, and then I was going to wear that other one that
Perfect. So as we look at how states reintroduce employees back into the state offices or have prepared to do so, it really starts with monitoring the prevalence of COVID-19 within the employee population, understanding the vaccination and testing rates, and leveraging this data to establish reopening guidelines, whether that's around sanitation, indoor capacity limits, spacing, and so forth. And this is largely the work that our public health agencies have been engaged with, amongst a whole variety of other things. So from an administration perspective, our role is to really operationalize that guidance in the form of, as I said, sanitation schedules, desk spacing, indoor capacity limits, and abiding by those. And more importantly, keeping an open line of authoritative communication with our employees as circumstances evolve, whether that's as a result of mutations and variants or capacity within our state offices themselves. This is critical for employee engagement, experience, and safety. Next slide. So as we talk about digital government, there are two technologies that we believe can help operationalize the safe return to the workplace. The first is dynamic hoteling. This is the concept that a state employee can schedule space in the state building before they come into the office. It means more dynamic use of the state building space, whether it's shared offices or individual offices. It means more people coming in and out of these buildings, and perhaps a reduced real estate footprint. The second is digital health passes. Now, this is not the same as track and trace. This is the concept of having a verifiable, tamper-proof digital credential on your phone that enables an individual to show proof of a negative COVID test or a vaccination upon entering a venue, thereby securing a COVID-free or a COVID-safe environment for all employees. There is no PHI or PII that sits on the digital credential or on a phone. And it's really just getting signals of yes or no, yes, issue a pass, no, don't issue a pass from the state's source system. It's really meant to replace or augment the CDC paper card that many of us get. So it can be printed out or on your phone, and it's scanned upon entrance into a state building. So let's take a look at how this works on the next slide. On step one, you see that the state determines its reopening guidance, right? So this could mean requirements around testing, around vaccination, etc. Those rules are then operationalized in a dynamic hoteling platform. Employees only see office spaces or time blocks that are available to them in compliance with those reopening guidelines that are safely available for them to use. Upon booking their time slot or their office space, they're then encouraged to download a digital credential. So the requirement may be, for example, that you have to be, have to have a negative COVID test prior to entering the building. They are encouraged to download their digital pass prior to entering that building. So when they go to do so, they have the digital pass on their phone, and upon entering the building, it is scanned. When they're scanned, it's validated that they are in fact, COVID safe, and they can enter the building. Now, once they leave, the hoteling solution already knows the time block that they've booked for themselves and can pre-schedule sanitation services or monitor the configuration of a state building environment to make sure that it is continuously safe. I think the concept of administrators being able to dynamically monitor and measure how they're doing, how their employee population is doing, is really critical and a very exciting component of this solution. So to tell you a little bit more about the digital health pass and the dynamic hoteling, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Josie.
Great, thanks, Sunana. We can go to the next slide. So I just want to talk in detail about some of the ways that, some of the things that we're seeing in the market. You've heard Sunana talk a little bit about, a way that you could use digital technology to help your employees return to the workplace. We understand that many are already going into the workplace from your polls, that people are already coming in. This is a way that helps with efficiency and helps you get the information that you need, and your workers get the information that they need to re-enter the workplace. So one thing is dynamic hoteling reservations. Sunana talked at a high level about this. This just gives you some screenshots or phone shots of what that could look like. And you can see here that an employee could go in, they would be able to book for themselves what location is available. And you can see that a lot of the locations are not available, and that's because of social distancing. And maybe they're not available because they haven't been cleaned, and they're not available. And it allows someone to go into the workplace in a safe way with the information they need about where they should be when they're in that workplace. You can also use something like this to help with the cleaning and the sanitizing process. So, because this is digital, your cleaning crew, your facilities crew may get an indication that, okay, this conference room needs to be cleaned because there were people that were occupying it. It also lets people book time in elevators, parking lots, all sorts of things. You can use this tool for anything. We know that this is one example. We know that there are lots of examples out there in the market. This is, again, just an example of how the technology can help support you and your workers get back into the workplace. Similarly, and with that, Sunana was mentioning how you could use a verified health credentials to ensure that people have the information that they need to get back into the workplace, and that they're following the state-by-state guidelines or regulations for people coming back into the workplace. And this is actually something that the state of New York is using. I don't know if people have seen the press release for that. They call it Excelsior, but this is a credential that they're using that it's voluntary for all members of that state, not just in the public space, but they are using this to verify their credentials, whether they've been vaccinated, whether they've been tested. It can also be used if you have other criteria. So if you're taking temperatures, or if you have people that want to, or if you want to just ask some questions on symptoms, you can also use something like this. The key is it's private. The consumer owns, or the employee owns that information. It's on their phone, and it is not shared, or it's not kept in a centralized place for anyone to access. So this technology allows you to be able to verify that people are able to come safely into a location. that they have received, you know, either a test, vaccination, or answered some questions that allow them to get into those locations. We can go to the next slide. One of the things that we know is very important to you is considering your real estate and considering your hoteling. So I shared with you an example of a couple of solutions, technologies that can help people get back into that space. But, you know, in addition, you may be considering other changes that you want to make to the types of space you have, and, you know, how much space that you have, how many buildings you have. So that is another thing that we've been talking a lot with our clients about. So state governments, in addition to corporate, many of them have similar concerns right now. And, you know, not only is the concern with the risk of the population, the risk of the people that are coming into those spaces, but also how much space are you going to need to have in the future as the future changes, the future of going into the workplace might change. And we know that public, you know, in the public space, may have more people that have essential workers. So you may, you know, of course, in the corporate world, there are essential workers as well, and manufacturing environments, et cetera. But there are a lot of organizations that can keep people remote for longer term than perhaps in the public space. In addition, in the public space, you may have a different needs in terms of your you owning versus leasing your government buildings, and so that may be a consideration. And so we are, you know, Amy's on the line. She's actually the expert in the space, and she's going to talk a little bit more about this. But we are doing a lot of thought leadership and having conversations and consulting with people, or here, I guess I should just say that we're hearing in the market how people are planning to use their space more efficiently as they go forward. One of the things we are hearing is that people are, with the vacancy of buildings, people are taking advantage of that, and they're updating spaces. They're modifying spaces so that and doing some projects that they had planned to do in the past but hadn't been able to do because people were using the spaces there. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sunana, but please post questions in the chat around hoteling and using spaces more efficiently, because we do have some experts on the line that are very familiar with that.
Thanks, Jyoti. Yeah, absolutely. We're looking forward to your questions on both hoteling and the digital credentials. So let's just wrap up on the next slide. You know, we really feel like planning for your journey back into the workplace is important, especially during these times. You know, by using these kinds of digital technologies, you can optimize your workplaces, prioritizing health and safety, which is a long-term trend we know and is important to employees, all of us. We can gain visibility into potential hotspots, especially over the next maybe year or plus if we continue to see variants. We want to make sure that employees are happy, safe, and also there's a certain level of confidence in coming back into the workplace that is enabled through both the hoteling as well as ensuring they're entering a COVID safe environment through those digital credentials. And by doing it through digital technologies, we're increasing the speed to deployment. So we're excited for your questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Pam.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sunana and Jyoti, both for the comments and the conversation. I'm really excited to really build upon that and hear our state chief administrators talk a little bit about what's happening in their states. Let me pause first and say I think 3 critical components came from what we heard from IBM Watson around NASCA's top 10 priorities for state chief administrators. We know all of our CAOs are looking to reduce their budgets across the board, looking at space optimizations, as well as find ways to move more enterprise-wide around digital government. So I think these are critical conversations that we're having. But let me first start with our 3 state chief administrators, Tricia, Amy, and then Brahm. Give us a little bit of maybe insight and an update on where your state is with your own remote work environment and returning to the workplace, and a little bit around some of those decisions, how you as a leader had to make some of those decisions moving folks back in. So let me start with Tricia.
Thank you very much. My name is Trisha Bach, and I'm the director for A&I in the state of Wyoming. We have been back. We never fully left the buildings. In the first few months, there were certainly very sparse employees in our state buildings. Myself, as the director of A&I, we have a lot of essential employees. So we have folks that are doing buildings and grounds and sanitation and custodial work. So along with trades. So we, as an agency, had probably more people in the workforce from the beginning of the pandemic all the way until now. Other agencies, some were fully out, except for maybe a few in the buildings. We tried to make sure that Wyoming had the ability to have open buildings. And we tried to figure out a way to do that as safely as we could. And we were pretty successful with that. So we never physically closed down all the buildings in the state. However, there were some challenges with that. And what you're discussing today is trying to make sure, if it is going to be 100% of the workforce back in the workplace, that is certainly a challenge that we have. We are currently working through the permanent telework policy. We just rolled that out in the last 2 weeks, I believe it was, specifically out to agencies. And what that means, we're on an emergency telework policy right now. And we were able to set that up through current systems that we had, the SABA, Halogen, the PMI system. We were able to do our telework policies through that. So that's kind of where Wyoming is. The governor just announced that anybody in Wyoming 16 years and older is available to get the vaccination. So that is a huge step forward to kind of slide into hopefully the end of some of the more difficult parts of the pandemic with people being vaccinated. That health checklist is a little bit easier if we can get over that hump. So that's where Wyoming is. I don't know. I think Pam might be having trouble.
Yeah, you know what? Pam just texted me that her camera just died. So thank you, Trisha. Why don't we jump over to Amy? And Amy, can you tell us a little bit about how we're doing in your state?
Sure. Thank you, Bram. Well, like Trisha, in Arkansas, we never completely left the office. We had those that we called critical to the operations of state government that stayed on site the entire time. Those that did work remotely started coming back last July. And then today, most of our state employees are back at work, with the exception of a few people with high-risk health conditions that are continuing to work remotely. And we have issued a May 17th date for return to work for all state employees. We've offered several vaccination clinics on site to help employees get to the point where they're ready, and giving them plenty of time to get the vaccine if they decide to. So that's where we are.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And I'll play Pam for a minute and I'll hand it over to me to talk a little bit about Michigan. So the first question that was asked was, what was the decision making that went into your current status as far as remote work? And I would say in Michigan, at least for those of us in state government, it was pretty easy because ever since very early on in the pandemic, we've actually had statewide orders that apply to all employees, not just state employees. Statewide orders that basically, the gist of it is, if you are able to do your work from home, you will do your work from home. And so what that left us to do at the agency level in state government was to look at the jobs and decide, is this something that we can adequately do from home or not? And so to a large extent, that made the decision-making process a little easier for us. Our current status is out of nearly 50,000 employees statewide, we have about 56% that are working remotely. But certainly, like within my agency, we're up around 85% that continue to work remotely. So right now we have direction from the Office of State Employer that remote work will continue until May 1st. like a kind of no earlier than May 1st, although I wouldn't be surprised if it got extended. Those of you, if you watch the news, you can see that Michigan is one of the hot spots, unfortunately, right now. So, every time it comes up in these 1-2 month increments, it's always looking at the data, looking at the trends to see, does this continue? So, but what we've done with that, given that we have over half of our workforce working remotely right now, we've taken the time over the last few months to really take a look at the statewide framework and rules around remote work. Michigan's always been pretty, I would say from a rules perspective, very friendly to remote work, but maybe culturally less friendly to remote work. So it wasn't that it was prohibited by the rules, it's just that managers, didn't know how to manage remotely to a large extent, and so they weren't comfortable with it. The last year has obviously changed that. So we've actually rolled out a statewide framework so that each agency can basically use the same criteria in their decision-making process post-pandemic to say what makes work for your agency. And, I would certainly, like all of us, expect to see a lot more remote work than we had a year ago. And the only other thing I would mention that, I think we'll come back to this a little bit, but for DTMB, as like most of the central service agencies where the chief administrators are represented in NASCA, one of our stated goals is real estate reduction. And that's been that for a long time, certainly before the pandemic. So we've been working with agencies, and it's still early days, right? We don't fully know what remote work will look like 2 years from now. We know there'll be more of it than there was a year ago, but we don't have all the answers. But even given that, we've already canceled 6 leases in the first, half of this year, and that's about 128,000 square feet. And the next 3 months, we're looking at another 5 leases, which is another 104,000 square feet. Now, certainly that's what we know right now. If you ask me again in 6 or 9 months, I would expect that number to be bigger. So that's current status of Michigan, and I think we got Pam back. So Pam, am I handing it back to you, or am I just going to keep talking here?
Well, Brom, thank you, first of all, for jumping in so quickly. I just want to make one quick point, and then I'll turn it back over to you. I think what we're hearing just initially here is the emphasis on policy and ensuring that our states really are taking a look at that written language around the use of work from any place or a remote environment, telework, whatever conditions or definitions that we're using, the critical importance that our states do take a look at what that policy is looking like. I'm really anxious to see how Tricia rolls this out in her state in Wyoming and what the outcome will be. So Brom, I do know we want to expand our conversation around the facilities footprint and how our states are really utilizing that as an opportunity to reduce some of the cost. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll tee that next question up.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks, Pam. All right, so we're just we got a whole bunch of questions here, and we're gonna rotate through some of our presenters. And so we're gonna start with Tricia, your first step on the hot seat. So many states are looking to reduce their facilities footprint. One way that state chief administrators are investigating that is through the use of space reservation systems, similar to what we talked about earlier here today with IBM. So this allows us more flexibility. It allows you to stagger staff in the office. It allows us to more easily, share space, divide time between home and office. How are you approaching available workspace in Wyoming?
Well, thank you, Brom. The first thing you talked about was the leasing footprint, and we are focused on the leasing footprint quite heavily. As you know, many states are like Wyoming, where we are looking at some budget cuts, and leasing is one of those. And that's one that I had put forth to the governor's office on our budget cut. Given that, like Michigan, it has been an ongoing, let's try to reduce leasing in the state. When the budget cuts came up and we had to do proposals, that was one of the things that I know the legislature and the governor's office were both receptive to say, okay, if we really want to look at cutting our leasing budget, we're going to utilize our telework. And that is key to the budget cut. So we're looking at about a 10% cut in leasing, approximately. In Wyoming, that equates probably much less than in Michigan, but it is 6.9 million, about $7 million. And we are well on our way with that. So we have eliminated many leases, and we are in the process of kind of reorganizing where some of the agencies are, moving them from lease space into state-owned space. So when we look at that, I have to bring up the fact that we had just done a major restoration of the Capitol, and a new Herschler building is what we call it. It's kind of the complex, the Capitol complex. And with that, when that design was done, it was cubicles, you know, a lot of open space with cubicles. That is very difficult in this environment right now. So when you look back at it, you're like, oof, you have this beautiful, I mean, it looks good, it's efficient, but boy, we're in a different situation now than we were 3 years ago. So that's one of the struggles we have. And some of our other buildings are more able to work in the telework hoteling area. It's much more difficult in the newer cubicle setups. So we do not currently have a hoteling system. It's certainly something that we would look at possibly in the future. One of the things that we had spoken with and wanted to make sure that the governor's office understood is we want to make sure telework isn't costing more, but maybe is cost neutral or less. And that's one way to promote, and we'll talk about the culture later, I think, in a couple other questions, but that's one way looking at it, is at least cost neutral. So one of the thoughts, well, all the state employees would get this or that device. Wyoming was lucky. We had a lot of employees who had laptops anyway. That's mostly what the employees had. We had a telework policy from 1999, I believe, 98 or 99. So it's similar to what Bram, you were saying with, it wasn't an issue with the policy. We had the policy, it was the culture. So this new policy that we have going out is updated. Obviously, our old policy was 3 days a week was pretty much all you could do. Now it's up to the directors of the specific agencies and letting them decide what works best for their workforce. And I think that's how we're looking at it, is each agency can say, no, we don't want to telework. We don't think it works for us. Another agency might have 70% teleworking. It all depends on what works for that agency. It's not a one size fits all. But one of the things we are utilizing is the calendar system, not unlike the hoteling system. So that is what we are using right now. We have a couple, as somebody else had said, and I'm not sure if it was Bram talking about, when there's people not in the space, we're able to reorganize and maybe do a little bit to adjust. A couple areas in our buildings, our state-owned buildings, were modified to be a telework hub. So they might be in close quarters, but there's plexiglass. And it's something that you can reserve to go in there. And I believe, at least up at the state library, I think it's 15 to 18 spots, which is a lot for Wyoming. And we have 8,500 or 8,000 positions in the state. So 18 or 15 in one building doesn't sound like a lot to Michigan, probably, but it's a bigger area for us in this city of Cheyenne. So that's kind of what we're looking at. I think if we go down the road and more people are teleworking and we train the managers on how to manage teleworkers, I think that's a big key too. And it gets more and more traction. I think hoteling software is something we probably would look at. We were lucky, like I said earlier, to be able to do the utilize our SABA systems for the telework policies. So that was something that didn't cost any more money. We didn't go out and buy everybody a cell phone. We didn't go out and buy all kinds of new equipment. So we were pretty ready to go. I think the majority of our staff was out within, I would say, a week or two of the notification that everybody was going to telework. So we were able to get everybody out within that week, and with a signed agreement saying you're teleworking and this is what that means. So that's where Wyoming is on leasing. And I would say that one of the concerns, and maybe this is something we could bring up later, if there's new administration 10 years from now that's, I don't like telework, everybody come back to work. Well, we just did all this with leasing. That is a concern. So that's something that we do have in the back of our head as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tricia. That's interesting. I was just talking with an agency last week about it, and they said the same thing. They said, well, here's what we're doing for now, but we're concerned about actually getting rid of this space because, this was a statewide elected, and, the next person that gets elected might have a totally different idea about it. And so to what extent do we go for efficiency versus, not precluding one of their successors from doing something? That's an interesting question. Yeah, thanks, Tricia. All right, well, let's go over to Amy and let's hear a little bit about Arkansas. So Amy, you mentioned earlier that most of your team is back in the office. And so, I just think back to the last year, and with 85% of my employees working remotely, certainly, I had fewer concerns about safety than you must have, over this last year. So tell us a little bit about that, about what did you do to protect your employees, and what were some of those tough decisions you had to make?
Well, back in 2018, we had also started the process of reducing our footprint in real estate and going with less square footage, smaller workstations. So when the pandemic hit, that was one of the first things we had to address. And we found a way to equip them with a plexiglass topper, so it would still separate people adequately while they were at their workstations. But, we're doing many of the things that other people are. Of course, we follow the federal and state guidance. We are screening at entrances or posting that people should self-screen if there's not someone there to physically screen them. We are using the mask, providing the PPE for all state employees, making sure we're distancing. Anytime we're in the common areas, everyone is wearing a mask. We have hosted the vaccination clinics, as I mentioned, really for that accessibility for staff to be able to get that, or we're providing work time. If they want to go get it from an alternate location, they can use work time to do that. We continue to use virtual meetings whenever possible. And in our meeting space, we have pulled out, limited the tables and chairs and spaced those out so people can adequately use those. And then just doing additional sanitizing throughout the day to keep things where they need to be.
Good. Well, thanks. Thanks for sharing that with us. So we're going to go over to Amy Hartz from IBM for a little bit of the private sector perspective on this. And so Amy, from your private sector lens, how are states boosting workspace efficiency while also focusing on health across the board? What are you seeing?
It's still a hybrid approach. Even at IBM, not all of our locations are open for business any more than the state locations are. So, when people are coming back in to these corporate spaces, they're also being asked to get a health pass. And once you get that health pass, we're asking them to go ahead and reserve a space for whatever that time block that they're going to be in the building. So we're using that right now. And really our public sector clients, as we talk to them, it's the same approach. I think the difference really between the corporate and the public is that public obviously had a lot more essential workers. There was really no way that you were going to shut down those locations like some of our corporate office spaces could. So for them, we really had to figure out quickly, how can we get people back into that building? And a lot of times we were just taking a floor print and we were saying, look, you've got assigned people in your cubicle farms right now, and we're going to just take away all of those assigned seating, and we're going to start to block off those spaces, and they can be reserved spaces now. And we had some tools that allowed us to say every other cubicle or every 3 cubicles, and just to give you that occupancy level that you were comfortable with social distancing. It actually goes a little bit beyond that though, because it's okay to get people in the spaces, but we also were working with our clients to figure out, how do we get the flows on those floor plans to work? As you come out of the building or the elevator, you have to turn left, and go around the space to try and avoid people. You could only go into the cafeteria if there was a below occupancy level, or maybe we were having food drop-offs at certain points too. So a lot of things like that, even down to elevator occupancy, to masks being required. And I think hand sanitizer spaces everywhere you looked really within the building. So it was a combination of trying to figure out how we could cope with all the people, but also give a lot of people the tools they needed to get back in those offices safely as well. And I think Amy also mentioned there's a lot of enhanced cleaning protocols. We found that a lot of people didn't necessarily want to come into the office, but when they did, they often were doing it because they had to have meetings with other people and they needed to be face to face. So we had a lot of reservations around conference room spaces that we also had to decrease some occupancy in, but we also didn't want people coming in and out of those spaces. So there were block offs. You were blocking off that space. It was being cleaned, and then we were letting the next wave of people in too. So there's a lot of different things that we're doing from that perspective. One of the interesting things too is there's a lot more building ownership, obviously, at the public and federal level. So when people were not occupying the space, I think a lot of folks were taking advantage of not having people there so they could go in and they could do the retrofit projects, whether it's laying down brand new carpeting or installing more high efficiency filter systems. You probably already had that in the budget to do, but it was a little bit easier because you didn't have to worry about the people moving in and out of the space as well. So you were also being able to take advantage of some deep cleaning opportunities that you might not have had in the past.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's always easier in the buildings when there are fewer people in the building.
Yes.
And just for everyone that is joining us, please continue to submit those questions. We will come back to those at the end. I think once we get through our questions here, Pam will help us choose some of those questions from the audience. So let's go back to Tricia and Amy from a state perspective. So I think, if your experience was anything like mine, very early in the year, I got very comfortable that we were able to do our jobs remotely, that we had the technology, that we had, all the cleaning protocols for those people that were still in the buildings. That was the initial concern, but very quickly I realized my team's got this. Everything's working, everything's good. And certainly my concern then, became much more on the people side of things, and wanting to be able to maintain those connections that we built over the years. And certainly when you onboard new people, when you're highly remote, that's one concern. How do you build and maintain those relationships? But then, also for your states that maybe have more people back in the office, maybe you have more, let's say a hybrid situation going on. So I'm just kind of curious, how are you balancing that? Like flexibility with the, still the need to build and maintain those relationships and keep employees engaged. And let's just, Tricia, let's go to you first.
Sure, and I think my experience is very similar to what you said in the beginning. I was like, oh my goodness, we have to have all these people telework, and it was a little panicky, and we were really burning the midnight oil trying to get all policies done with the governor's office, and all that was so crazy in the beginning. And then all of a sudden it was like, this is working. And I was a little bit surprised, not probably less surprised than others, but I felt like we're finally catching up to the private sector, where we're starting, we were forced to do this. And then a lot of folks who may have been really against telework were surprised at the level of work. We actually saw production go up when people were working from home. And there were some pains, Zoom pains, Google Meet pains, whatever they were. But I think you're right with the agencies who have a lot of forward-facing, public-facing, public coming into the buildings. We're struggling with how to get that balance, because a lot of that was now you had to call in for the public. There were some Zoom meetings for the public, but when you have folks that are needing their workers' comp or going through and getting benefits, those are the areas that I think the agencies that deal more with that were a little more stressed about that. And so I would say that the Department of Workforce Services in Wyoming really stepped up and was able to figure out a way to balance that. And I wish I would have thought about this, but I would have talked with her before I came on to see where they were. But they really got a hybrid of people being able to come in and meet, the plexiglass, all of those things were done very early on with workforce services. So I would say that the agencies that have that public facing stepped up and figured out a way to still allow the public to come in and have face-to-face contact, maybe through plexiglass, but at least they were able to get in. Because when you start looking at telework and electronically meeting with people, there's a lot of people out there that cannot do it. They don't have the internet access in Wyoming. They don't have the technology. So we had to figure out a way to do that. And I think that I think the agencies that were able to do that really stepped up and figured out a way to do it.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. Amy, anything you want to add to that?
You know, Brom, I think you hit on one of the major components. You know, it's not that some of us can't work remotely and perform our jobs, but it's the culture that really takes a hit when we're separated that way. Walmart is headquartered here in Arkansas, and in a conversation with the CEO, they're still working remotely at their headquarters. You know, and so it's working very well. But the question was, you know, are you going to continue to do that? And they're worried about their culture as well. They want to bring people back together just so they can have that sense of belonging. So I think it's something both in the public and the private sector that we're all facing, and how we overcome that. Here in my department, some of the things that we did, we had put together a team across all the divisions that really just focused on keeping us connected, even when we were remote, or as we've come back to work, everyone still stays kind of within their division, within their specific area, much more than they used to. So we're using our virtual platforms to keep people connected, and just, you know, some fun things that we've done. Back in the winter, we did an ugly sweater contest, and everyone got to see everyone's sweater on their computer and vote. And we just do fun prizes that are donated. We've done a food drive during the holidays as well. I made it a competition between divisions. And just had daily updates. It's just the fun things like that that have really kept people together. A March Madness kickoff party where we just kind of had people come and go a few at a time to keep us connected. And then, you know, just a monthly newsletter where we try to highlight those things and events and recognize staff that are really what we call giving epic service. So those are some of the things that we're doing here in the state.
Okay, thanks, Amy. So we'll go over to Amy Harps at IBM. So Amy, we heard from your colleagues a little bit earlier about the benefits of the concept of, you know, this kind of space reservations and being able to do that, to utilize space more efficiently. How do you see technology solutions aiding in this outcome?
We have a lot of different technologies right now. And part of where we came from a reservation system really was from an occupancy system. We were very much used to having people, you know, put your butt in the seat and that's where you were assigned. So we've had to shift a little bit, and we shifted the technology to be able to do those types of space reservations. But we had to elevate the technology too, to, you know, do the dynamic planning. Do you need to be socially distanced 6 feet? What's your preference? Do you prefer 12 feet? And we were able to make the technology automatically do that for us too. So we've had to do that. Part of this is really also putting the technology out there in the hands of the user. So when Sunana and Jyoti were showing you our previous slide presentation, you saw some of the screenshots sitting there on the actual phones. And you could just have your user really go in there, get the health path, but then really go all the way down and take a look at different spaces on the floor plan and let them choose what they wanted to do. And if they needed to put in video conferencing, for example, we were able to serve that information up. Or if you need to look for a certain asset in the room, we were able to do that too. So there's a lot of technologies that we're bringing to bear. Beyond that, though, we're also trying to take advantage of really sensors, cameras, Wi-Fi as well. So we're able to find a heat map on your floor plans now, and you can even have your own employees come and look at what those floor plans look like to say, look, you know, there's a lot of people clustering in the cafeteria right now. Based on what sensors or Wi-Fi are telling me, I'm going to hold off and go down there a little bit later on. So we're just taking advantage of some infrastructure that's available to us to get that information as well. So there's some of the things that we're doing. I think when we look overall, we were talking about returning to workplace. We also think of it as the flexible workplace as well. So the technologies that we're bringing to bear, they're not just here because of the return to work in the pandemic. We really always developed and we're continuing to develop them in order to make the flexible workspace happen, giving your employees a lot more flexibility in what they want, and making them more comfortable in their environments.
Thanks, Amy. Well, this next question, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. I'm maybe just going to ask for one answer on this. And I don't know if it's Amy from IBM or Sunana from IBM, but how do you view, like, how important do you think it is to have a reliable system to monitor and track, outbreaks or surges in the pandemic?
Yeah, I think coming from a public health background, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, we are still seeing variants that are becoming the dominant strain in many different in many different jurisdictions, which can then, migrate across state lines. So having an outbreak, being able to visualize when an outbreak occurs and then dynamically shift, whether it's the occupancy of a state building or communications and policy for telework, is, I think, critically important, and something that a digital solution enables a little bit more regularly or readily than what we have today.
Okay, yeah, good point. Thank you. All right, so we're on last question. We're going to do this lightning round, and so Amy and Tricia will go to Amy Fetcher first. So just really quick answers on this, so we can get to maybe a question or two. As a leader in your state, what advice can you give your colleagues around space optimization? How do you optimize space while at the same time take all the precautions necessary to keep people healthy and safe?
Quickly, I would say follow the federal guidelines and your state guidelines, provide protective gear for all your employees, make accommodations for any staff as needed, and promote the vaccination and make it accessible to employees.
Okay, thanks. Tricia?
I would echo everything Amy just mentioned. I would also say flexible workspace, which Amy Harpst brought up. That is what we're looking at, making sure supervisors understand that having that flexibility also helps the culture in both ways. So if we can have a flexible workspace and allow people to telework, even if you as a supervisor are a little bit angsty about it, that is something that is part of the culture now. And if you can allow that flexibility, you're going to have happier employees. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, it all comes back to the people. I don't even know why we're surprised anymore. I mean, we joke in IT, hey, the IT part's easy. It's the people, that's hard. Or you can fill in any blank there, IT, facilities, whatever it is. But all right, so Pam, I think we have about 2 minutes left in this segment. Is there a question or two that you want to throw out for the panel?
Oh, thanks, Bron. We've had several questions come in on chat. They're all excellent. It's really hard to pick one, but there are a couple that resonate around workspaces and work institutions, as far as the place that we feel like are our own. We always thought we had our desk, our locker, our space. So how are states, and then as well as looking at IBM, how can a system really help as we're looking at those more we spaces, those touchdown points? Really, how do we take some of that space, make it more a reservation opportunity? Not only do we reduce our footprint, but also, again, bringing in the technology to allow for that. So let me start with Brom to see, have you all done any of this more we space in Michigan?
Yeah, we're starting to, and I can tell you my team's probably sick to death of me using the phrase hoteling first, and just really getting away from the idea that you have a desk. That's not your desk. That's our desk. that's the agency's desk, and you can use it some of the time, right? And so, but the conversations I'm having with staff are, there's a trade-off here. I want to be able to, post-pandemic, I want to be able to provide more flexibility. I want to give you opportunities to work remotely sometimes. I think that's important. It's important for you, it's important for me, it's important for our organization. But part of the trade-off is maybe workstations will be smaller. Maybe you'll share your workstation. So I'm really trying to pitch it as a, give a little, get a little, that kind of situation, because people get very protective about their desk and their chair and their parking spot, right? Those are the three that we seem, the holy trinity, if you will, of kind of facilities and space.
You have parking spots? That's awesome. Well, one of the things that, and just to go kind of off of what Bram said, is that we just moved, A and I just moved from a building to another building in order to play the game of moving people around and utilizing, optimizing spaces. And we just went through this with some folks that are teleworking, the majority. They're in maybe once a week for every 6 weeks or so. So they did not get the nicer offices. They're in a work share area, or they're in more of an open area. So we just went through that process. The people that are not teleworking generally did get the nicer offices. But even then, they're still, when they telework on every other day or whatever they're doing, they're sharing that space. So I would say that that is a discussion that's ongoing here in Wyoming, and we just had that with ANI. So and it's a struggle, and I'm trying to do the same thing that Bram is doing. Is hey, you're only here 1 week out of every 6. You can use this desk. This is the desk. This is your desk. So I would say basically the same thing with Bram.
And Amy, I know you all are mostly back, but any opportunities for you all to look at shared space in Arkansas?
We had already begun sharing all of the common spaces post-pandemic. So that was one thing that took our staff a little bit of time getting used to. They didn't all have to have their own conference room that they were going to use once a week or once a month for a group. So we went to the whole building shares common areas. So it does take some getting used to, and people are very territorial. But what we found is when they do it, they really enjoy that, and they enjoy the interaction with people outside of their division that they get from that common space. So it's been good.
Fantastic. And last word to our team from IBM, thoughts on a system that might be successful and helpful to states. Sunana, I'll let you start.
Well, we really think that, we have solutions obviously that are available for dynamic hoteling, and that in combination with the IBM Digital Health Pass, which, as Jyoti mentioned, has gone live statewide in the state of New York, could really provide both the hoteling experience, the hoteling first, as well as the consumer confidence or employee confidence needed to get back in to the workplaces full time. So I'll turn it over to Amy if she has any last words to say about the hoteling solution.
No, I'm a fan too. Obviously, I worked in the workspace for a couple of decades now, and it's been interesting to really see this shift. 20 years ago, we actually were having conversations with corporate clients about, hoteling and flexible workspaces. It shifted back again to assigned seating, and I think now, as we're coming into the pandemic era, I hate to say that way, it's definitely more from a flexible standpoint now, but I think that's going to continue as well. But there's always going to be a hybrid approach that's needed.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for your comments today, for bringing your thought leadership to NASCA. We're going to throw up an evaluation question for you as we're rounding out this afternoon. But thank you so much, Sunana, Jyoti, Amy from IBM, as well as Bram, Trisha, and Amy, our state chief administrators. Thank you again for giving of your time to NASCA, your thought leadership, and for being with us today. All of this information is going to be up on NASCA's website. We have a knowledge center that you can go to and find the slides, recording. You can share this within your teams as well. And be sure to continue to work with us as we move throughout our year of the top 10 priorities for state chief administrators. and moving into our live events coming up later this year. We're excited to be back in the same room together to continue to unpack some of these conversations. So again, take a second, give us some of your feedback. It really helps our NASCA team as we're planning these events for you. But thank you so much for being here with us today. Have a fantastic afternoon.
Thank you.